Hi everyone, Stjepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Scotch game with the Scotch Gambit, which is perhaps the most aggressive way for white to play the Scotch, and in theory it should be fine for black if black knows what he is doing. There are several ways to equalize in most variations, but if black doesn't know what he's doing, he could be in trouble, because as with all gambits, you get the initiative, you get quick development, and you have an attack basically for material, in this case for the pawn. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now if you haven't seen the introductory video on the Scotch, please do, to make sure you can grasp the basics and the main ideas behind the opening and why white plays what he plays here, the Scotch with d4. I don't want to get into that here. And now we are looking at the move e takes d4 for black, the only sound move, simply taking the pawn, and white has now managed to free up his e4 pawn. It's now able to move, and white removed the central tension with these two pawns, and we are basically going to have a semi-open or an open center. The center is not going to be closed with all of the pawns on e and the d files. And later on we are going to look at the best move in the position, simply taking the pawn, which is the main line, knight takes. From here on there have been more than 15,000 games, Grandmaster games, and today we are going to focus on the slightly dubious bishop to c4, the Scotch Gambit. I say slightly dubious because I really don't think that players below Grandmaster level should avoid it, because most people who aren't Grandmasters won't be able to punish it every single time or punish it properly. And it's not as if white is sacrificing a knight or a rook or a bishop or something. He's giving up a pawn, and in most cases it's temporary. So black captured on d4, white didn't recapture the pawn even though he could have. Instead he developed his very strong bishop to look at f7, and this in a way reminds me of the fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann. I just want to show you this this variation. The idea is practically the same. So c6, d4, d5, white plays f3, and in one of the main lines black captures, plays the active move e5, white plays knight to f3, and after black takes here, white simply develops the bishop to c4, and as you can see, the variation is pretty similar. The knight is here on c6 and the pawn is still on f2, but the setup is the attacking setup for white is similar. And now players with black often make mistakes such as bishop to g4, and this variation is now simply busted. Let's say here, king takes here or here, and white would win material. Of course, recapture the bishop and win the game. Shouldn't recapture with the queen, because queen here check wins back the knight, but I don't want to get into this opening either. So anyway, I wanted to show you this as an attacking setup which is common in many openings. So white has sacrificed his d4 pawn for the initiative, and here we are going to look at two moves. One of them is going to be bishop c5, the Hexo Gambit, and the other one is going to be knight to f6, which is the Dubois-Reti defense. And some variations, some lines in the Scotch Gambit have names, some don't. I've mentioned the ones that do here on the right side of the screen, and I try to do that whenever it's possible. So knight to f6 is the main move, so I want to look at the sideline bishop c5 first, because I think it's very interesting. I've spent some time yesterday looking at games with my coach. He plays the Scotch sometimes, and he plays e5 with black, so he faces the Scotch. And in one of his very interesting games, he played bishop c5. So in this position, after the Scotch Gambit, bishop c5 is the Hexo Gambit. Now white has three different moves, all of which are fun, I would say, and all of which are scary. One of them is c3. Which is a full pawn gambit, and it's in fact the main move. The other one is castles, and the last one is knight to g5, which is the most aggressive. I want to look at c3 first. After c3, black shouldn't really take, because that would justify the gambit, and taking and allowing this would be just too much activity for white. So after the move c3, black should simply develop with the move knight to f6, and white takes, c takes d4. And in this line, we have now transposed to the gioco piano, the Greco Gambit in the Italian. And in this position, after c takes d4, you have the, I'm just going to show you that position on the board as well. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, c3, knight to f6, the position where white plays d4 immediately, allowing this check on b4, and now e takes d4, c takes d4, bishop check, bishop to d2, bishop takes, knight takes, d5 takes, knight takes, and now queen to b3. This is a very common line in the Italian, and it can actually be entered here from the Scotch. So in this position, after bishop to c4, the Scotch Gambit, bishop c5, c3, knight to f6. If white captures, c takes d4, you have now transposed to that line in the Italian defense. And I want to show you one trick here. So after the following moves, bishop e4, and the line that we just saw here, after white plays queen to b3, this is basically an invitation for a draw, because the knight is under pressure, the pawn is under pressure, and black has to do something to defend. If he defends with the bishop, white is going to take on b7, and then the knight is going to be hanging, so there is no time for rook to b8, and moving the knight would be a concession, the c knight, of course. If he moves the d knight, then f7 is hanging. So the main move in this position is knight to a5, attacking the queen, and queen to a4 check. Now the knight is attacked, and the knight needs to come back. So after knight c6, queen b3, you have the repetition, which is very commonly seen in grandmaster games, and many of the games are drawn. Now the only way for black to avoid the draw would be knight c to e7, and after knight c to e7, both sides castle, and white is considered to have a slight edge. So if you manage to get this position and you are playing a lower rated opponent, then, well, what can you do? You either draw or are slightly better. Lower rated opponents are not going to play knight c to e7. But white can avoid the draw as well. So I would advise you to study this line in the Italian if you play the Scotch Gambit, because it's easy to transpose. So once again, if bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, if you take on d4, you enter the Italian. The other move that you can play is the move e5, which is slightly more aggressive. And now you enter a sort of Deutsch Gambit position, which I like playing with the white pieces, so d5. The difference is that you have a pawn on c3, so bishop to b5 is the most common move. In this variation, taking here and taking here isn't really as good as in the Deutsch Gambit. Here black is supposed to be slightly better, and of course the difference is that you haven't castled yet, so you don't have a rook to e1. So it's the Deutsch Gambit with the pawn on c3 instead of castling, which is an inferior position to play that. So after e5, d5, you don't really take the knight, you play the move bishop to b5. After bishop b5, knight e4, cd4, bishop b6, you have regained your pawn, and you have a perfectly playable position with some attacking chances. I actually prefer white here. So I would say that if you're playing a lower rated opponent, in the position after c3, knight to f6, cd4 should be avoided because it's most likely going to end in a draw. Play e5 instead, it's very aggressive, and you're going to have a lot of chances with the move. So that's about the move c3. So once again, after c3, knight to f6 is basically forced. Taking is not good. Knight f6, either cd4 or e5. The other move I wanted to show you after bishop to c5 is castles. And this is the most straightforward, I would say, way to play this position. Now you open up the opportunities for Deutsch Gambit-like ideas because you have castled. But after d6, the main move is c3, challenging the center. Once again, black shouldn't really try to do anything aggressive or saving the pawn or something like that. Black should simply develop, because as I said, white's initiative can be deadly. So black plays bishop to g4 here, developing the bishop, pinning the knight. And now we enter another variation which is pretty forced, which you simply have to memorize. This is the Cochrane-Anderson variation, which the engines don't really understand. And once again, I've been discussing it with Mate yesterday, my coach, and he concluded that it's better for black. I'm not really sure, but I know that I wouldn't be comfortable playing it with either side because it's really unclear. So after bishop g4, there have been about 30 games in this line, so it's well known. The line is queen to b3, allowing white to capture here, black to capture here, and putting pressure on f7 and on b7. So the variation actually goes bishop takes f3, bishop f7 check, king f8, gf3, knight to f6, attacking the bishop now, or preparing to attack the bishop. And the main move is bishop to, the main move is bishop to c4. And this variation, the engine says it's minus 0.7 for black. Both sides have 7 pawns. I'm really not sure which side I would choose. White still has pressure on b7, and the black king isn't allowed to castle. On the other hand, the white king is awkward as well, and white is still to develop his minor pieces. So black is ahead in development, and you could argue that the king's safety is equal. So after bishop c4, bishop c5, if you don't want to enter that variation, castles shouldn't really be played because it's really hard to avoid. So castles, if you know the variation very well, this one after bishop g4, the Cochrane-Anderson, then okay, you can play it and perhaps confuse your opponent. But otherwise, I would recommend after bishop c5, the move c3, which we have just seen, either transposing to the Italian or playing the aggressive e5. Now the third option is really fun, also forced, and also slightly better for black, according to strong players and according to the engines, but it's, in my opinion, more complicated to play for black than for white. The move is the very aggressive knight to g5. This is the Serret variation, simply putting pressure on the f7 pawn. And you might think that knight to h6 defends everything, but it really does not. There's another move, knight to e5, but that's really scary looking because of f4, and you basically lose the game. So the only defense is knight to h6, and now using the geometry of the board and the queen, white sacrifices a piece temporarily. So remember this pattern, knight takes f7, black is forced to take, there's nothing else to do, knight takes f7, now bishop check, black has to take, king takes, queen h5 check, winning the bishop back, and after g6, queen takes c5, you can see that both sides have 7 pawns, black has doubled pawns in the center, and black's king is unable to move, and this is why I believe that it's easier to play for white. On the other hand, the engines will tell you that it's almost -1 for black. So if you can argue with them over the board, please do, and I think that the variation is fine for white, and I actually want to play it for white. I'm not afraid of it. The main move here is either d6 or d5. D6 is more common, queen to b5. Now black's plan is to develop as soon as possible. White wants to create an attack and develop the rest of his minor pieces. So very interesting variation. So basically after d4, the Scotch, e d4, bishop c4, the Scotch Gambit, if black goes for bishop c5, then white has at his disposal 3 quite different moves and 3 completely different ideas. Castles goes into a slightly worse position, which is complicated for black. Knight g5 goes into a slightly worse position, which is complicated for black. And c3 goes into a better position for white, either transposing to the Italian or with the advance e5. So bishop c5 is, in my opinion, an inferior move to knight to f6, simply because white can create a repertoire against it easily and play very strong moves against it. So if I played the Scotch over the board and somebody played bishop to c5, I would be very happy. Okay, the second move and the main move after d4, e takes d4, bishop c4 is knight to f6. Now we are going to look at 2 variations, 2 moves, e5 and castles. Castles is a sideline which I'm not really sure I would play it. e5 is much better in my opinion, but castles, and black can now capture the pawn on e4. Knight takes e4, rook to e1, seemingly putting pressure on the knight, but there's the move d5. And white now needs to know the forced lines, which are common in the Italian as well, with the knight on c3 putting pressure on the queen and the d4 pawn being pinned. This is a common theme. So you can simply take the pawn, bishop takes d5, and after queen takes d5, you have the resource knight to c3. The knight is pinned, it cannot move, the pawn is pinned, it cannot take the knight, so the queen is attacked, and the knight is now double attacked. So after queen to a5, which is considered to be the best move, of course you take with the knight. It's much better to take with the knight. Knight takes e4. Black has to do something about the discover check, even though there's not that many strong moves, but still bishop e6. And now the strong move, bishop, knight e to g5, castles queenside, and white wins the pawn back. So a very forced line, which I'm not too convinced about. I think that black is perfectly equal here, if not better. castled queen side, both sides have attacking chances, but I actually prefer black. I think the engine thinks it's equal, or that black is slightly better. No, the engine thinks it's all zeros, almost completely equal. So if it's completely equal, I'm not sure that you should go for that with the white pieces. So I would recommend that after bishop c4, if black plays the move knight to f6, even though you can win your pawns back on e4 and on e6, even though black plays perfectly, I would recommend a more aggressive variation with e5. After e5, things are not that simple for black. d5 is the main move. Now, once again, the Deutsch Gambit idea with taking here, taking here doesn't work for two reasons: because you haven't castled yet, so you don't have rook to e1, and because of the fact that the bishop is still defending g7. This is not the Italian, so the bishop is not on c5. So this doesn't work. You have to play bishop to b5. After bishop to b5, the pawn, of course, cannot be captured, and the d4 pawn is hanging. It's attacked twice now. So black plays the move knight to e4. This is considered to be the best response, not retreating the knight, but advancing it forward. And now white puts pressure on c6. Knight takes d4. Now, of course, if black does nothing, white is going to capture, and win the rook, win the game. Black has two options here. I think the second one is more interesting. The main line goes bishop to d7, simply defending, and bishop c6, bc6 castles. This is the starting position. And the second move black has at his disposal is the move bishop c5, counter-attacking. So now, if you take with the bishop, black is simply going to recapture, and you don't have a check with your knight, and your f2 pawn is hanging. And if you take with your knight, knight takes c6, then black has the intermezzo, bishop takes f2, and after king to f1, white is actually the one in trouble. Queen h4, save the knight, knight d4 check, and now c6, chasing the bishop away, knight to f3, knight g3, king takes, knight e4. I mean, you're not losing in a forcing way, but it's just much harder to play. So after the move bishop to c5, don't blunder with knight takes, because f2 is too much to give away. Simply play bishop to e3, and now you have refuted the move bishop c5. And after bishop to d7, which is the main line, you have transposed to the main line with the bishops being put on e3 and c5 as intermezzo moves. So now the line goes bishop c6, bc6, knight d2, knight takes d2, queen takes d2, queen e7. Pressure on the e5 pawn, but nothing major really, and white has an elegant way to resolve the issue with knight to b3, attacking the bishop. If the bishop takes the bishop, then the queen will be defending the pawn, and if the main move bishop to b6, white can simply castle, and it's far too scary for black to capture this, because his king is still on e8, and after the move rook to e1, black will be almost lost. So let's look at the main moves once more. So d4, e takes d4, Scotch Gambit, bishop c4. We are now looking at knight to f6, the Dubois Reti defense. We are looking at the move e5. d5 has to be played, bishop to b5. Don't take on f6, it's losing. Knight to e4, knight takes d4, putting pressure on c6. Now bishop c5, if bishop c5, bishop e3, if bishop d7, the main line, then bishop takes c6, bc6, castles. And now on the board you have a position with both sides have 7 pawns. Black has doubled pawns on the c-file, but in compensation for that he has the bishop pair. The development is actually equal. White is yet to develop his queen side, and black is yet to castle, so not much going on there. As far as attacking plans go, for black, I think the move bishop to c5 is very strong, and especially if white decides to defend the f4 pawn, the e5 pawn with f4, and you have the constant struggle in white's position to save the e5 pawn, and same as with the Schmidt variation, which we are going to look at later on in one of the next videos. White is going to have problems saving the e5 pawn, and he's either going to sacrifice it at the correct moment for the initiative, or simply lose it and basically be worse. So in this position, white wins 31% of the games, black wins 27%, so slightly better for white. A perfectly playable variation, the Scotch Gambit, in my opinion. If this is the main line, and this is what you get, a completely equal position. If black plays perfectly, then fine, I'll have it. I like the variation. And as I said, there is room for black to go wrong. And now, let's say bishop c5. Let's just follow the line for a while. Let's turn on the engine. Bishop c5, f3 is the main move here, chasing the knight away. The knight goes to g5, and now you can play f4, but I actually don't like the move f4. I prefer bishop to e3, simply to unpin. Bishop b6 because the bishop was undefended, and now f4, knight back to e4, and now we have the move knight to d2. So we are always counting on the move knight to d2. Just remember to play bishop e3 before that. Always queen takes. And yeah, black has c5, but well, I don't think it's a strong after knight to f3 because you're blocking your bishop. If you play the move c4, then white will have a wonderful square for his pieces, so the main move is d4. And after d4, this is still a pretty forced line. About 60 games in this position. Yeah, bishop c6 is the main move, and bishop h4 attacking the queen is the main move. So black has the bishop pair, which is fairly strong, but if he ever wants to activate dark squared bishop, then d4 is going to be weakened. And as I said, I prefer white. So to conclude with, I think that the Scotch Gambit is a perfectly playable pawn sacrifice, which, well, it can be regained most of the time, and even if it's not, I think white has tremendous attacking chances in most lines, and white is perfectly fine. So playable. As I said before, anything below grandmaster level, you really needn't be afraid to play bishop c4. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Let me know what you think about the Scotch Gambit. We are going to continue with the Gehring Gambit tomorrow. And yeah, thanks for the support. Thanks for the kind comments. Stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye-bye.